Good afternoon. I am Mindy Lavelle, and on behalf of Fresno State and the Lyle Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, thank you for joining us for our first of two Pay It Forward events for this fall. It's wonderful to have a great number of returning attendees to Pay It Forward, as well as new guests that are here for the first time. I guess one benefit of holding this our Pay It Forward online is that I noticed in the registrations that we have people from outside of California who have also joined us today. So a special welcome to those of you who are scattered around the US. Since late 2015, Pay It Forward has been providing an avenue to bring together Fresno State students of all disciplines and a wide, diverse network of community professionals. From the beginning, there have been three goals. The first goal was to create an interdisciplinary forum where students throughout the campus, regardless of their school, college, or department, could meet for meaningful conversation and dialogue with community professionals from every corner of our community, as well as the surrounding communities. Our reach has gone throughout the Central Valley. The second goal is the commitment to provide a free sit-down lunch at the event for both students and community-wide professionals. Sharing a meal together provides a sense of community and establishes a foundation for networking and conversation. And finally, each event features a speaker or panel of speakers with roots to the Central Valley that would be asked to share his or her professional journey with the audience with the intent to inspire our students. Over the years, we have transformed to meet new opportunities and create additional value. We've extended invitations to Fresno City College, as well as Clovis Community and Reedley College, and a number of the local high schools. Prior to COVID-19, which started way back, and it seems like forever ago, but in March 2020, we held 24 in-person luncheons, 2 to 3 per semester. However, given the restrictions of COVID, we made the decision to convert the programming into these webinar series. Although this did not allow us to achieve all of our goals, it did continue to provide programming to the students and to our community, and has continued to attract anywhere between 180 to 250 people per session. Unfortunately, COVID restrictions are still hindering our activities on campus. And although we got close to saying, yes, we're going to have lunch together today, we felt that we had to pull back at the last minute because it just for concerns of our own students as well as from the community members at large. So we are back on a webinar. This is our 5th webinar, and I am delighted to now have the opportunity to introduce our speaker today, John Dolan, who will be kicking us off on our 5th Pay It Forward webinar. Although John is new to Fresno, he is a native Californian who was lured back to the West Coast. I think that's the right way I can say we lured you back, to head up the Fresno Zoo after a very successful career in New York. John took over the helm of the zoo earlier this year during a very turbulent time, not at the zoo particularly, but in our world and our community with COVID. And he is the 8th leader to hold this critical position in the 90-year-old history of this much loved institution in the Valley. John's experience spans over 25 years with world-class zoos and wildlife organizations. John served as the director of the New York Aquarium for over 12 years. And at that same time, he was leading the New York Aquarium, he was highly involved in project design and management at the Bronx Zoo. John is a graduate of a sister school of ours, Humboldt State University, with a BA in biology, and holds a master's degree from the prestigious architecture school at Parsons School of Design in New York. Throughout his career, John has led the development of authentic and immersive educational experiences and has built a strong commitment to wildlife conservation that is both transformative as well as innovative. His background and his love for the industry will help continue to build upon the strong foundation of one of the most beloved institutions in our own backyard, the Fresno Zoo. Before I turn the program over to John, I want to remind those who are with us today in the audience that if you have any questions for John throughout the webinar, please put those in the Q&A channel, and we will absolutely get to them at the end of the John's session. Also, I am really excited to announce that for the students who are participating today, at the end of John's presentation, I will ask you a question pertaining to his something that he discussed during his talk. The first two students that send the correct answer via the Q&A channel will get a 1-year membership for two students. So two students will receive a 1-year membership to the Fresno Zoo. And that includes all sorts of wonderful things. And I think you'll be delighted because it's one of my go-to places that I go to frequently. And I can't wait to share the zoo with two of our students. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Mendy. And thanks, Mendy, for the team, Gabe and Tina, for everybody at Pay It Forward, of course, the Lyle Center and Fresno State University. I'm happy to say, I'm very pleased that there'll be a quiz at the end of my presentation. So it always makes me happy. Before I get started showing some slides of the work that I've been involved with and sort of the way my career arc has taken, just want to give you a little background. As Mendy mentioned, I am born and raised here in California. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in a suburb of Los Angeles, Woodland Hills. And I think it's important, as you'll see throughout my career, one of the first things that anybody who knows me realized when I was little is that I was obsessed with animals. And as that grew, it became an equal sort of passion for the environment and for nature. And really that love of animals sort of was an intellectual feeling, and then really a sort of core passion that developed around nature. So of course you're a little kid. If you're a little kid growing up in the Central Valley and you are passionate about animals, you might think about, working in ag. But if you're growing up in a suburb of Los Angeles, the only thing that any little kid knows about working with animals is that veterinarians work with animals. So of course, my goal when I was growing up was to be a veterinarian all through my youth. So when I went to what I'm diplomatically going to call the second best California State University, Humboldt State, that was my goal. I was going to get my pre-vet work done there, graduate and go on to work as a veterinarian. So it was with more than a little bit of confusion and sadness that I realized that I just was not cut out to be a veterinarian. And that was not going to be a good career path for me. I did some volunteer work with a vet. I did not find it all that stimulating. I think most people that knew me could tell that I did not necessarily have the temperament to be a good veterinarian or even a good biologist from the science perspective of becoming a scientist per se. Because at that time I was also developing a lot of other passions. As I got older, I was really into music, and I was really into sort of creating a scene. I started to produce musical acts in Humboldt County and started to run nightclubs and book bands. So I got really into the music scene, and what I discovered when I was doing that is I could create experiences for people that brought them together and really created a shared sense of community. If it was around music, that was great. At the same time, I was keeping in touch with animals. I was continuing to work. I actually was managing a nightclub and running a dairy goat farm at one point. So that was an interesting combination. But the point is that I kept in touch with my passions, even though at that point I couldn't see how to bring them together necessarily. I wound up in New York City through a rather long chain of circumstance. But when I got there, I realized that I needed to grow up and get a job and start actually developing a career. So I started my graduate work in architecture. And in my last year of graduate school, our design program was to come up with an exhibit. So I went up to the Bronx Zoo to do some research for my design program. And I discovered that they were building a exhibit called the Congo Gorilla Forest, which was for me sort of quite honestly, a life-changing event, because I realized something that I think most people don't ever get a chance to realize, which is zoos do amazing things and they do a lot of different things. And one of the most exciting things they do is create these beautiful, incredibly challenging design experiences in the form of zoo exhibitry. So I was very fortunate when I graduated. I went to the Bronx Zoo and I decided to keep haunting their doors until they hired me, which they did. So I'm now going to share my screen, and let's all cross our fingers that this works. Can you see my screen okay? Okay. So as I said, the first job I had was with the Bronx Zoo. The Bronx Zoo, I should point out very quickly, I'm just going to give a little background here, is part of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And it was my good fortune to work for this organization from the outset, because the Wildlife Conservation Society owns both the Bronx Zoo and the New York Aquarium. So it is deeply engaged in this profession of inspiring people through face-to-face interactions with wildlife. But it's also an on-the-ground wildlife and conservation organization, right? There are 1,200 people in the organization dispersed around the globe working in the field in projects to save wildlife. So it's much more than a zoo and aquarium. And because of the nature of the work, it brings a much deeper conservation message to the zoo and the aquarium when it's coming to exhibit design. And that's really what informed me as I went forward. And the first project I worked on was called the Congo Gorilla Forest. This was sort of a profession shaping and changing exhibit in many, many ways, and certainly an incredible way to start my own career. The thing about the Congo Gorilla Forest is that it was one of the most innovative and powerful moves away from traditional zoo exhibit design, which has traditionally been to show perhaps a single animal or at most a group of the same species out of context so that you could really get the feel for the animal itself, but you got no idea of how that animal fit into a habitat or an ecosystem and what was the life of the place where this came from. So when we started building the Congo Gorilla Forest, we really wanted to talk about saving vulnerable species using some ambassador animals from representative of that habitat. We wanted to talk about using that inspiration and that excitement that comes from viewing those animals up close to raise awareness, to sort of create this sense of connection between our work across the globe and how that could result in saving wildlife. So our people are out there discovering what animals need. We are involving the local people in those conservation projects, and that results in protecting wild places and saving wildlife. And that's what a zoo visitor takes part in when they go visit the Bronx Zoo and the Congo Gorilla Forest. It's an exhibit that is deeply set in a sense of place. And again, traditional and older zoo exhibits often had no context of where animals belonged in the wild. But the Congo Gorilla Forest was all about creating this sense of place. And it was the Central African rainforest and the lowland gorillas that were found there. So it's about an 8-acre exhibit, multi-experiential, as you'll see as we go through it. And one of the great things about zoo exhibit design, and as an architect coming into it, one of the things that immediately excited me was the idea that it's a very challenging design program because you're doing two things simultaneously, and they're both difficult to pull off well. One is this sort of immersive theatrical aspect of the guest experience, the visitor, and what they are seeing and what they are experiencing as they move through. But the other is this very practical and pragmatic aspect of creating safe spaces for staff and animals to hold, to shift, to care, to manage, and the husbandry that goes on. So it is a very distinct programmatic aspects that have to work seamlessly together. And from an architectural perspective, it's really an amazing challenge and quite interesting to do both of those things, to create this sense of immersion in place, and how we worked that both as a sort of statement of design, but also a very deeply emotional experience that recreated, in this case of the Congo gorilla forest, a sense of what it might be like to see this wildlife in the habitat of the Central African rainforest. So traditional zoos in their exhibit design was all about clear views of the animals. But in the Congo gorilla forest, we actually worked quite often to create sort of screened views of the animals so that you got that sense of how you might see them in the wild, but we could still bring you around into places where you could see them quite clearly. And you get the sense here of the immersion aspect of this, the deep canopy, the deep green, the deep sense of being in foliage along with this animal. And because of the screened views and the way you can see these animals, you often see the way their evolved characteristics work. So when you're looking at an okapi, for example, in the play of light and shadow that a screened vegetation can give it, you start to understand that incredibly beautiful coat coloring and the way that is evolved to help it be disguised within a thick rainforest setting. The other things we do is we really wanted people to look around the exhibit at things other than the animals, right? To understand, again, the way habitat works. So you might be looking up into a canopy and never even realize that when you're up there, there are things in play. So whether it is a weaver bird nest or a tree snake moving through, you get a sense of reward as you go through this exhibit more than once. You're always going to discover new things that are not interpreted, not pointed out, but for yours to discover in the same way a scientist would, or any person would, as they were moving through a space like this. And it's more than just the views that we set, but with water and the play of all of that, we're trying to create this immersive effect, both with sound, with sight, and even with feel, right? As you're moving through this pathway through the first part of the exhibit, you're surrounded and immersed in fog and this setting of rainforest that is hard to recreate in any other way. But it's also a place where we can really delve down into the megafauna, right? The charismatic megafauna when we're talking about gorillas or okapi, but we're also wanted a chance to really talk about the interplay between these different communities that make up an ecosystem. So we can bring you into spaces here, the Discovery Gallery, where we can use jewel-like settings of small terrariums and aquariums to talk about the smaller life of a rainforest, but always with this sense of building that idea of connection and understanding that no one part of this ecosystem can thrive unless they all thrive. That if we value those charismatic megafauna, we have to value the overall health of that ecosystem. And this is a really different way to present animals. It's a different way to talk about animals too, by using, in a multi-species exhibit like this, where you have the red river hogs and the mandrills, to create an exhibit where both of them can exhibit together, but they can use different aspects of the exhibit. So they're actually sort of using the vertical space as much as they are the horizontal space of that exhibit. And how do we interpret all of this from the guest perspective? How do we create signage and interpretation that really reinforces the idea of animal behavior, natural animal behavior, and the connections and links between all of these things, even between, the healthy detritivores of a forest breaking things down and finding a palm larvae, for example, a palmworm larvae out there, and how mandrills would find that in a forest. So that's an actual active interaction where people can lift up a leaf and discover that themselves, just the way a foraging animal would. Bringing a variety of species into play and being able to swing from outside to inside was a major component of this exhibit. But this was all themed around conservation of this really threatened rainforest in Central Africa. And the thematic element that we pulled together here was the way logging and roads that cut into the rainforest result in wildlife loss, right? And we were taking some risks here, including using what, and I'm going to just let you all know here, some very disturbing imagery, because we wanted to tell that story in such a way that people would be affected by it emotionally and make that connection. So when we're talking about a road into the rainforest to log, we're also talking about bushmeat and the inevitable degradation of the habitat that comes from that simple act of building a road. And the loss of these, millennia old trees that can never be replaced, and what that means to an interlinked habitat like this. But of course, we want to tell a story of hope. We want to tell a story of the work. So one innovative part of this exhibit was to create a theater. As you move through this exhibit, then you are able to sit down and watch a 6-minute film that talks about our work in Africa, the WCS's work in Africa to save gorillas. But at the end of that movie, then the screen pulls aside, opens up, and reveals this incredible gorilla exhibit, where we not only are showing you this sort of panorama of the rainforest, but through clever design aspects, allowing two troops of animals, two troops of gorillas, to be side by side, which is a very compelling visual way to display these animals and to get people close to them. But from the standpoint of the animals, it's always incredibly interactive and enriching to have them be able to not only have these natural behaviors in their own exhibitry, but to be able to smell and hear each other over these barriers, because that creates all sorts of behaviors that you might not otherwise see in exhibit, where these animals are able to display those behaviors. Really powerful and a really great way for people to be able to see these animals up close, interacting with each other in a safe way, and showing off incredible natural behaviors, including, again, using the verticality of these exhibits to really show off what these animals can do, how they use these habitats in the wild. But perhaps one of the most innovative things that we did in this exhibit, again, to bring it back to conservation, as you moved through it, as you saw, we talked about okapi. We talked about Red River hogs and mandrills. We talked about gorillas. And even though we didn't have bush elephants in there, we talked about elephants because that was a big conservation project. And they're also a really important component from an ecological standpoint of the Central African rainforest. So those were 4 animals that could serve as 4 different ambassadors for 4 different conservation projects that we had in Africa. So guests would come through. At the beginning, they were asked for a donation, but at the end of the exhibit experience, they were given a choice as to where their donation would go and what it would support from a conservation project already in place. So you can see when they went to the screen, they had those 4 habitats to try to protect, the ambassadors for each one of those, and their votes went and divided up the money for those projects. So this was raising well over $200,000 a year for direct conservation projects in Africa when it opened up. It is an exhibit that shaped me in terms of how I think about the emotional connection that comes from being face to face with wildlife. It's an exhibit that shaped me in terms of how we can move people from that inspirational moment to an engagement with conservation that goes on. And it's an exhibit that shaped my thinking about the fact that although technology comes into play all the time, there is no substitute for that moment. So that after my 10-year career at the Bronx Zoo, when they asked me to be the director of the New York Aquarium, I tried to bring those same sorts of priorities to the design of our aquarium exhibits that we went on. And the most important exhibit that I was able to take all the way from design to construction was the Ocean Wonders Shark exhibit. It opened in 2019. It was the sort of culmination of my career for sure. It was an amazing opportunity to not only create, again, amazing experiences around wildlife, but from a purely architectural standpoint, it was much more freeing to actually build a building that had an architectural statement attached to it. And you can just, I'm just going to show you as this comes out of the ground. It's a massive building. It's 58,000 square feet with all sorts of logistical challenges of getting things in during construction. That's a big acrylic tunnel that's flying in. You can see it coming into place there. And then the final aspect of that once it was built. But as I said, this exhibit was also intended to be an architectural statement, and that was incredibly freeing because we usually look to immerse people and to sort of hide the architecture, if you will. But this was our opportunity to create a sort of iconic statement on the Coney Island Boardwalk in Brooklyn. And you can see what we did is we wrapped this building in a shimmering screen of tiles that moved in the wind. So they were hinged, so every wind movement would map on the surface of this building. They reflected the sky and the light so that it created this sort of constantly moving and shimmering pattern that was evocative of birds, flocks, or schools of fish, that same sort of movement. It was very powerful, whether it was during the day, in the evening, or in the morning, or at night. So it really was a chance to create not only a presence for the aquarium visitor, but a presence for anybody who was on the beach in Coney Island to have this amazing experience at any time of the day, watching this building quite literally move. But from the exhibit standpoint itself, we really needed to do a few things. And I think this is important from a design perspective, to always have your program very clearly defined as you go in. So of course, the first thing we wanted to do is we wanted to really up the exhibit experience at the New York Aquarium. To take what was an older and quite frankly, a little bit run down aquarium when I got there, and to really create a brand new sense, a brand, if you will, that said, this is a really great place. So we wanted to deliver on guest expectations around those charismatic megafauna. There's nothing that fascinates and attracts like sharks in an aquarium. So it was a perfect animal for us. But it was also an opportunity for us to take this apex predator, which is in danger around the world and really threatened. In fact, shark populations have dropped 80 to 90% around the globe, and that has tremendous impacts from an ecological standpoint on marine habitat. So we had a chance to tie guest hopes and expectations and fascination to a really important conservation message that could tie not only to the animal itself, but to larger questions of ocean habitat. Talk about the primary threats to shark, which are 99% human driven, to show how we are working around the world to save sharks, because not only do we display them at the New York Aquarium, of course, but the wildlife conservation scientists, marine scientists, are working around the world to save those sharks. But the last thing that we did, which I think was probably the most important, is we took sharks as an ambassador to take an urban populace who was visiting the New York Aquarium, one of the most densely urbanized places in the world, New York City, and let them know that there is a thriving community of wildlife surrounding that city, and it's pretty amazing. So to connect New Yorkers to their own habitat that surrounds them, to their own history and heritage of wildlife that surrounds them, is and remains an amazing opportunity to build conservation awareness and engagement. So how did we do that from an exhibit perspective? Well, the first thing we did, of course, is we wanted to create some multi-experiential, right? So we didn't want to just do one thing, we wanted to do many things, all of them reinforcing the message that sharks are amazing, sharks are highly evolved and adapted to be apex predators, sharks are found around the world, including New York City, and that sharks are in threat, are under threat. So we started with a coral reef that you could walk right through, because we wanted to start with a place that was warm and familiar and had positive affinity. We know many people, when they're coming to see sharks, are coming out of a sense that fascination that edges towards fear. And we wanted to really make people understand that whether you love sharks or fear sharks, if you understand their importance to the places that we love, you'll be inclined to protect sharks. So coral reefs depend on those apex predators to stay healthy. We wanted to give kids a chance to get hands-on, to be interactive. It's difficult in an aquarium where you're constantly behind glass. So we created galleries that were just about hands-on experience. We also learned that Brooklyn school children are incredibly difficult on shark jaws, but that's no different from Central Valley school kids, as it turns out. And we wanted to start talking about that, the threats that sharks face. And they face that from bycatch in the fishing industry and from targeted fishing for fins, which has really accelerated shark loss over the last couple of decades. And we wanted, again, to use that as a chance to talk about the fact that New York City, the city that we think of in so many ways, from Broadway to finance or whatever it may be, is actually a city of islands surrounded by an ocean that is filled with wildlife, including sharks, 26 species of sharks in New York waters. But along with that, then 6 species of great whales, including blue whales, humpback whales, right whales, 8 species of sea turtles, 316 species of fish. It's just an amazing aggregation of wildlife that people don't think of as being right in the waters of New York City. So as we started talking about that and engaging people with that and waking them up to this idea, it was a much larger component than merely talking about sharks, even though sharks were our key species to get into that discussion. We could set it up in any number of ways. We could talk about the beauty of those New York waters. We featured, almost outside of that coral reef exhibit, everything you saw in this exhibit was native to the New York waters. But we could also use that to talk about our own work coming out of the New York Aquarium to tag and study sharks and understand their habitat needs and migratory movements up and down the coast and what was going on. We could talk about our work on a policy perspective, not only in the field, but in policy, to really affect conservation change in New York City and protect these animals and other animals, and to work towards establishing a national marine sanctuary right off the coast of New York City. A sanctuary that would be centered on the Hudson Canyon, which is an amazing submarine canyon off the coast of New York, which we could then recreate in very incredibly powerful and immersive ways. So these messages tie together with, again, that payoff of face-to-face with wildlife, face-to-face with your own heritage, your own opportunity to be engaged with conservation. But we brought this full circle because the last gallery in Ocean Wonders about sharks was a gallery that talked solely about what we could do in an urban setting to really affect marine conservation, to eliminate single-use plastics, to think very carefully about what we bought in the stores, and to think about what we bought at the seafood counters as well. We had classroom spaces here, of course. We had a bar and restaurant on the roof, so we were thinking deeply about sustainable business practices in order to keep doing what we do. We even had a restaurant that opened out to the boardwalk that was another moment where we could feature mission messages, because that was all sustainable seafood and eliminated single-use plastic from all aspects of the operation. But perhaps the most powerful thing we could do was take that gallery and talk about the threats to wildlife and create a campaign that really focused in on single-use plastic, and specifically single-use plastic straws in New York City. And that engagement with our visitors allowed us to create a campaign in the city of New York called Give a Sip that resulted in the elimination of single-use plastic straws throughout the city of New York, which was a tremendous win for conservation, a great way to engage our visitors with the message, and for them to feel like they had a stake and a sense of power around conservation engagement. So a really great way to wrap up my career in New York City, and a really great way to bring that thinking into my next step here at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. Because what I loved about the Fresno Chaffee Zoo from the moment I started interviewing for this job was this sense that it is already being transformed, that I am the great beneficiary of many hardworking visionary folks who brought this zoo from this to this, and who understand that that moment of connection and excitement can be built on with moments where we actually engage in conservation messaging with the animals in our care, acting as ambassadors for larger conservation and science issues. That we can take charismatic megafauna, as we've done in our African adventure exhibit, that people love to see and are deeply moved by, and put them in a setting along with elephants, but create a sense of connection and place and habitat, in this case, the savannas of East Africa, and to create exhibits that deeply move people, but get them to think about a sense of place, a sense of connection, and a sense of habitat. We're doing that right now with our latest exhibit, which is called Kingdoms of Asia, which will open next year, towards the end of next year, which was a great way to engage people in, we have a lot of communities right here in the Central Valley from Southeast Asia, which this exhibit is themed about. So this was an opportunity for us to extend our sense of engagement to the communities around the zoo and say to an advisory group from Southeast Asian communities, hey, are we doing this exhibit right? Are we featuring these aspects of your culture correctly, sensitively, and appropriately? And how can we tell the stories of your community, even as we are telling the stories of the wildlife in these areas? So it's been a way to deepen our engagement with communities. It's been a way to deepen our ideas of conservation and what that means. And quite frankly, this is where we are going with future exhibits. We're using this sort of beloved aspect of the Fresno Chaffee Zoo to really think deeply about how we create movements around conservation action that include communities and include engagement on justice issues. Because we know that we are creating a sense of conservationists, but we're also creating the next generation of conservation stewards. When we're doing these exhibits correctly, we are engaging you from a very emotional place, and we're moving you potentially into career choices, including really significant conservation work that we're doing right now, saving the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, which is a critically endangered species endemic to the Central Valley that is now being propagated here at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo very successfully to build a reintroduction program that'll bring these back to the Central Valley after being almost completely extirpated. So that is rather a lot of slides, but it is an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about how I got where I am and to this great place in Fresno Chaffee Zoo where we inspire wonder, create connections, build community, and save wildlife. The last thing I want to say, I'm just going to use my own experience in life. I know a lot of people here are college students and still thinking through what their own career paths might be. And I hope that some of this was clear in my conversation and my presentation that I just had with you. But I want to make it clear that I honestly did not know what I was doing until it happened. And by that, I mean, I was doing one thing very smart. From a very early age, I sort of identified and understood that I had core passions in my life. So I was able to keep myself open, even though my pathway was I never anticipated working in zoos and aquariums. I never anticipated doing exhibit design. But when those opportunities opened up to me and I saw that this was a way to engage not only things that I was interested in, but my core passions of working with animals, connecting people to nature, I think that realizing that my interest in animals and nature could take me to places that I had not imagined when I was a young kid was really, really important. And it was not linear. So I'm just going to encourage everybody who's looking for their career pathway and perhaps doesn't see it so clearly, be patient, don't be afraid, and keep swimming.
John, thank you so much. Let me get my video back on here. There we go. Thank you, John. Great presentation. There were a number of questions that came in, but also a number of questions that were submitted when our audience realized that you were coming as our guest speaker today. So I'm going to jump right in, if that's possible. The first question from one of our guests asks, you mentioned making exhibits immersive. How do you find what makes something immersive? He has a business and he's always trying to enhance his experiences, and he would like to know what you define immersive as.
So again, and I hope this came through in some of what I showed, but immersion is much more than just the visual, right? If we're really trying to take people to a place, we have to think very carefully about what creates a sense of place. So again, it's often the use not only of appropriate plantings, right? So that's one big aspect of what we do from a design standpoint is the horticultural, right? What are trees or other plants that will grow in the climate that we're at, but will evoke a climate that we want to, right? So we're not in Southeast Asia here, but we can, working very carefully, think about what plants will grow in our climate that will create that sense of a heavy canopy, immersive aspect of that. But it's also through the use of sound, whether that is water moving or ambient sound that can be played through speakers, or using the animals themselves and their calls, et cetera, as a sense of creating what we all think of when we're in a place, right? Which is it's multi-sensory. It's not just visual. And those aspects, I think, can be thought through very carefully just by thinking through your own experiences in these places.
That's terrific. Another question I think is really fascinating as well is that looking at the exhibits that you've helped create, or you've led the innovation, and it looks like you've used a lot of technology to make these zoos as innovative as possible. Did you partner with, one of the questions was, did you partner with external technology companies or government agencies, or were you able to produce those types of exhibits all in-house?
Yeah, so it depends, and it depends from facility to facility. With the Wildlife Conservation Society, I was very fortunate to work in a group that was large enough to support its own design shop. So we were essentially our own design shop. But even there, you're bringing in outside consultants, right? Nobody's an expert in everything. So certainly, I think you can start with a concept, but part of what you're doing is then engaging in a dialogue with the experts around that. So when we're talking about technology, for example, we can say, we want to create this effect, or we want people to feel this, or we want to get this information across in a very clear and innovative way. And then listen to the experts in technology tell us, well, we could do this, or we could do this, or have you thought about doing this? And that's one of the great things, I didn't emphasize this perhaps enough, but one of the great things about zoos is it's surprising how many things, zoos and aquariums, how many things go on that have nothing to do, quote unquote, directly with animal care per se, right? Whether it's designing the exhibits, planting out the horticultural aspect of it, thinking through technology, the education, the immersive, the interpretive aspects of.
Well, exactly. That leads me to one of the other questions is one of the students wanted to know what types of positions and jobs go on within a zoo. And I think you're talking about that right there.
And and now I'm, at an administrative and executive level, so it's even more. And so think about it. There's HR, of course. There's the business aspects of what we do, right? We have to keep our doors open and have revenue streams. Education is a huge part of what we do. So we have a whole, slew of educators who are working with kids all the way from elementary to, quite frankly, college internships. We just had a great meeting with Fresno State yesterday about our internship programs. So you name it, I promise you, it will touch on some aspect of what a zoo or aquarium does. And that, again, is why I'm saying, if you identify your core passion as animals, but you're a baker, I promise you, we have a way to do this. If you're a banker, we have a way to do this.
And I think that's really important for our students to hear, because oftentimes we don't know what happens behind that door. And there's so many possibilities using many of the skills that they're learning currently at school, which kind of led me to the next question that just floated in. And that was, There is a great desire to somehow volunteer or get involved, and I'm happy to hear about you talking with Fresno State about internships.
Right.
How can people do that if they choose, they want to? How can they volunteer or help the Fresno Zoo?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for even considering that. It is something that we do have a really significant cadre of volunteers. We have about 250 volunteers here, and we couldn't do what we do without them. So there's a number of ways. First of all, we are working with Fresno State. So if you're a Fresno State student or engaged with the university, we're working on internships, community service projects, and paid internships as well, right? So there's all sorts of ways to get engaged, from construction management all the way down to animal care. The other thing that we do is we take in volunteers as docents all the time. So you can work at the zoo in a volunteer capacity to interpret exhibits, to greet guests, to really share information. We train those people. And again, they provide a tremendous value, not only to our guests, but to our operation. So if you go to FresnoChaffeeZoo.org, you will see a tab for volunteer, get involved, and you can go right there and find out all the opportunities.
John, one of our faculty members has indicated in the chat that he's in the anthropology department, and then there's a long history with apprenticeships at the zoo,
Yes.
and several of our graduates have worked there.
That's right.
Another question that I have is, what advice would you personally give to our graduating seniors as they embark on their professional journey?
Well, I'll say this. For lots of people, that's clear. If you're asking the question, it may not be as clear, right? So for some people, there's a very clear linear career path. I'm going to go from point A to point B. I'm going to get my CPA, and I'm going to be there, right? For other people, and this is, again, this is my background, this is my story, that is much less clear. They have interests that they're pursuing that don't necessarily clearly point to, a shining star that says, here's your career path. So again, what I want to encourage everybody is understand yourself and spend some time with your college advisors or whoever that may be to identify what your core passions in life are, because I guarantee no matter what you do in life, if you feel like it's feeding your core passions, you're going to have a great career. Identify those core passions and then realize, again, and it's just what the zoo is a perfect microcosm and an example. If you are somebody who is interested in psychology and behavior, but always wish that you could work with animals in some way, shape, or form, or cared about conservation in the environment, a zoo is a perfect thing, because all we do all day long is think through carefully these behavioral questions. Or if you're in the hospitality business, but you want to have an impact, that's what we're doing. We are raising money for conservation through these revenue streams. So I would just say, if you identify your core passion and you think very broadly about what the opportunities to connect with that are, you will be surprised, and I think really, really excited about the different ways you can feed that passion that lead to a rewarding career that's actually also one that you can live on.
Gosh, we have several more questions that have just popped in. One of the questions is, and I think you probably have answered this in different ways throughout the presentation, but what can we do in Fresno to help with conservation, not only locally, but also in other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, because it can appear daunting in some ways, right? It's like, how do I do this? And of course, there's a simple answer. Well, you can support conservation organizations, including the Fresno Chaffee Zoo, through donations or whatever. That's great, and it's greatly appreciated. But I think there's a lot more that you can do. For example, right here in Fresno, just like literally outside of our city boundary, is the San Joaquin River, which the San Joaquin River Conservancy has purchased thousands of acres of land to protect that riparian corridor along that river. That is an incredible place for people who want to make a difference in terms of local conservation. We don't even know what's out there, right? We haven't done yet the biological surveys that will answer questions of what wildlife is there that we can either save, or if in the case of invasives, sort of corral and how do we get people out there to experience that? How do we create that sense of wellness that comes from experiencing green nature from the standpoint of our own health and well-being? And lastly, how do we connect Fresno and Fresno County to the history of our place here, right? This is the place where the first peoples collected their basket making material, their food, everything else. This is the place where settlers, from Europe who came in here needed the water in order to create this agricultural paradise that we live in. These are core connections and core sort of environments that tie us to our own history and our own heritage. And that is a way in which conservation is not just an abstract, but something that resonates with your life right here in Fresno County. So I would ask anybody who's interested in doing that, look for, whether it's the Fresno Chaffee Zoo, the Conservancy, Audubon, you can find a way, Sierra Club, they're all out there and they have multiple projects that you can go anywhere from like, oh yeah, I want to be a member and support them, or I want to actually be hands-on and engaged in those activities.
I appreciate both of those because there are a lot of students, and I know a lot of community members that would like to get more involved hands-on, but they also want to hopefully help financially keep
Yes.
our efforts moving forward and keeping what we're doing as strong as possible. The second half of that question was really, there are so many places in the world that we read about and hear about, and including our own backyard here, that need assistance. Is there anything that we can do locally here to help those parts of the world that are in dramatic danger?
Well, I think, so everything looks daunting if you look at it as a whole, right? If we're talking about drought, if we're talking about dynamic climate, if we are talking about even something like plastic, right? It's ubiquitous and it seems like insurmountable if you look at it as a whole. And so what I encourage people to do, optimism comes from taking actionable steps that make a difference. And in the aggregate, we can then make a change, right? So yeah, if I start being thoughtful about my single-use plastic, and I start cutting down on that myself, and I really start to make it. Does that make a difference overall? Probably not. But if I do that and I encourage my friends and my family to do that, and we all start to have a greater consciousness around that and make those efforts, then in the aggregate, yeah, we can actually make a difference. And that leads to all sorts of thinking, right? Our challenges around water here in the valley are not going to go away. So one of the things that I think is start getting engaged in the conversations and the discourse around this. There's no right or wrong answer. We live in an agricultural area. We need water, but there's also no simple way to just say, so we're going to have all the water we need. We have to start thinking carefully and engaging in dialogue. And that is conservation at the end of the day. It's engaging communities in conservation to accomplish these things that will allow us to not only live our lives, but live fulfilled lives.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I'm not sure if we should just end on that note because it's so powerful, or I have a couple more questions. Does the Fresno Zoo focus on sustainability? I think I know the answer, but this was an answer from somebody in our audience. Focus on sustainability in all that you do, and is the zoo involved with local legislation to help change laws to make more commercial fields more sustainable?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges we have because, we're human and we have a history and we have a long operation too. So the true answer is when I got here, we were still serving. I mean, I hate to harp on single-use plastic, but it's a good example, right? We were still serving had messages about save the planet. And yet when you went to our snack bar, your water or your soda came in a single-use plastic bottle, right? So we have eliminated all of that. We have conducted an energy audit and we've conducted a plastic use audit because frankly, that public facing aspect is just one part of the operation, right? We get things that are shrink wrapped, we get things that are wrapped in plastic, or right? So what the first thing to do is to collect the data that will drive your decisions and then look for the ways that you can eliminate that. So in answer to the questioner, we are not entirely sustainable. Our goal is to get to carbon neutrality, and we are on our way to do that. It'll be a long trip to get there. Yeah. But if we don't do that, then we don't have much credibility in our messaging around conservation. And we can't really talk to our guests about, we know it's difficult, but you can make a difference.
Yeah, excellent point. And John, what an amazing, we are so glad that you are here in Fresno and that your journey has brought you here. From my perspective, I loved hearing several of the comments that you made, and with the students in mind about, you never know where your journey might lead. You might take a right turn or a left turn, it's all very distinct. And just to stay very alert to the possibilities and to follow that passion, I think you'll always enjoy your days if you're doing it with passion.
That is right.
For the students out there, before we wrap up, I have the question for you. And the first two who actually send in their responses in the Q&A channel will get a membership to the Fresno Zoo that you will enjoy for the whole year. And this is a perfect time for you to take your friends and really get to know all the wonderful things that are going on. And I agree with John that the zoo has been in transformation for well over a decade, and it continues to transform and innovate and create not only a wonderful experience for the guest, but important messages throughout your time at the zoo. So for those students, tune in. I hope that you've been listening carefully. What is the first exhibit John worked on at the Bronx Zoo? And we will let those come in. And John, I can't tell you enough. Thank you so much for participating. I can't wait to get back to the zoo myself. And thank you everybody who've attended today. It's an important conversation. And like I said, John, I'm so glad you're in our community and the impact that you're going to help make on what we considered one of our most important gyms in our region, the Fresno Zoo. I can't wait to see what's next. And we really appreciate everything that you're doing and your team is doing. And I urge everybody to make a visit when you can. I know I've read everything. We're still very conscientious about COVID and wearing masks, so wear your masks. But it is outdoors, and it's just a fun way to spend a day with family or even on your own. So, John, thank you so much. And again, thank you for everybody for joining us. And stay tuned. We will have another Pay It Forward event in November. So look forward to those messages. And let me see if I will have to, let me see if I can clearly see who is our winner today. I know we had a number of people going in very quickly. And I do see there's a couple of winners, and we will contact you. And as soon as our presentation is over today, and get you your annual pass. And once again, thank you, everybody. It's been fun, and thank you, John. Much appreciated.
Thank you all very much.